And I'll introduce the learning for Hanukkah by first reviewing with you all what midrash is. What is midrash? You'll hear this word sometimes. I'll look at the midrash, I'll say, there's a midrash that teaches this. So, what is the midrash? Well, rabbinic literature, early rabbinic literature, um, can be divided into two main topics. There's Talmudic literature, and Talmudic literature is based on a book called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the base text of the oral law. It's a legal text that goes through the categories of life, everything from marriage to divorce to the laws of agriculture. We saw in the series we did over the past few weeks, right? The laws of tithing are found in the Mishnah. And then the Talmud comments on those laws. But as I said, the base text is the Mishnah. Midrash dates from the same era as the Talmud, but the base text for the Midrash is the Torah itself. So we'll take a verse in the Bible, and that verse might present some questions, maybe some missing information that the rabbis say ought to be filled in. So they tell the story that's not found in the story of the Torah. So the most famous midrash, the one that you probably all know, is the story of Abraham smashing the idols in his father's idol shop. Remember that Abraham is introduced in the Torah without any backstory. It just says God showed up, spoke to Abraham, and said, "Go forth to the land that I will show you." Well, how did God choose Abraham? What did Abraham do or believe to merit that special relationship, that special commandment that God gave him, and the special inheritance that God promises to him? Well, the Torah doesn't answer that question. So it is the Midrash that comes in and introduces this myth, right? And by myth, I don't mean fairy tale. By myth, I mean a story that probably people had been telling for a long time orally, and it gets written down to explain this piece of the story that's left out. And you know that story. It's that Abraham was working in his father's idol shop and said, "How could you believe in these stone objects?" And he smashed them. And I don't remember exactly the story, but you know what I'm talking about. This story in the Midrash about Abraham and his father's idol shop. And that's how Abraham comes to realize there is one God in the world. And because Abraham realizes that there's one God, that one God shows up and talks to him and says, "Okay, you believe that I exist. You've figured it out, the way the world works, and now I have a special mission for you." And that's the explanation of how Abraham was chosen. So that is Midrash, stories that explain biblical information. There's also, by the way, a topic in Midrash called Midrash Halacha. Midrash Halacha, as opposed to stories, are laws that are based on verses in the Torah. So the main difference between the Talmud and the Midrash is not that one deals with Jewish law and one deals with stories. The Talmud also has stories in it. It's that the base text, the root text that is being commented upon, is the Torah in Midrash versus the Mishnah in the Talmud. Okay? So that's a little introduction to Marilyn is saying the story about Moshe putting hot coal on his lips to explain his speech impediment. Is that Midrash? Yes, it is. So, and there are many, many such stories in Midrash, and we're going to learn one today. So I'm going to explain to you how it is that we're learning about Hanukkah from a Midrash. Because what should surprise you is, well, if the base text of Midrash is the Torah, well, how can we learn anything about the story of Hanukkah from the Torah? Because the Torah doesn't speak of Hanukkah. The Torah was edited, composed, closed long before the holiday of Hanukkah was ever introduced. So I'll try and answer that question for you as we look at the sources. Okay, so again, in the chat dialogue, you can see the link to the PDF of the sources, but I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can go over them together. Okay, can I call upon Stan? You look innocent. Can I ask you to read for us the verse upon which we will comment in the Torah? This is Parshat Beha'alotcha. So just so you understand the context of this verse, this is right after, in the book of Numbers, the princes of all the tribes bring their gifts for the dedication of the sanctuary. All the princes come and they bring similar gifts, right? And then we read Parshat Be'ahalotcha, and this is how Parshat Be'ahalotcha begins. Go ahead, Stan.
Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and say to him, when you mount the lamps, let the 7 lamps give light at the front of the lampstand." Aaron did so. He mounted the lamps at the front of the lampstand as the Lord had commanded Moses.
So this is a special verse. Thank you, Stan. This is a special verse at the beginning of Parshat Beha'alotcha, which raises a lot of interesting questions. First of all, why is God speaking to Moses instead of speaking to Aaron directly? It says, God says to Moses, go tell Aaron. So that's one of the questions we ought to ask about this verse. Why is it that that Aaron is not being spoken to directly? Now then, this weird language, what do you say to him? Beha'alotcha et hanerot. What is la'alot? La'alot is to ascend. Shir hama'alot, to ascend, arise. It's a weird verse, a weird verb to describe candle lighting. You know, don't you agree, Stan? It should say when you light the candles.
Yeah,
light
not when
the
you
candles,
go, not when you go up.
Mount the candles or mount the lamps. Is it mount the lamps or mount the lights? And what does that mean, mount the lamps? I thought we have the golden menorah and we just kindle each one of the flames so that we can have a burning flame on top of the menorah. But this weird language, when you lift up the lamps or lift up the lights, and then here's another strange word, El Mul Pnei HaMenorah. The English that you read, Stan, says the 7 lights will give light at the front of the lampstand. But actually, mul means, even in modern Hebrew, it means to stand opposite somebody. So if I was going to use the word in Hebrew, ani omed mimulech, I'm standing opposite of you, I would also use that word mul. I'm standing opposite you. Well, what does that mean? You're lighting candles opposite the lampstand? In front of the lampstand? I thought the candles were on top of the lampstand. So what does that mean? That's how you're watching that's how you're lighting the candles in front of them. And it says, Ya'iru Shivat Hanerot. So they will be the 7 lights of the menorah will be lit opposite the lampstand or in front of the lampstand. I'm just explaining to you that this is a verse that's going to open up the midrashic imagination, because the words are strange, they're not obvious, the ideas in there are confusing. And anytime you have a verse like this in the Bible, an important verse like this, then the midrash is going to come in and say, aha, I'll explain to you what's really going on here. That's the cue to the midrash, okay? But again, I'm reminding you, this verse has nothing to do with Hanukkah, obviously. Not yet. We didn't learn yet that it has something to do with Hanukkah. This is about the lighting of the menorah, which will be in the temple, okay? Or here, it's in the desert tabernacle. So the 7 lights will be kindled, and Aaron did this, again, Vayaz ken Aaron, el mul penei ha-menorah. He did this opposite the lampstand, or in front of the lampstand. This word again, he'elah beha'alotcha. He let those lights rise up. Ka'asher tziva Hashem et Moshe, just like Hashem commanded Moses ought to be done. Okay, that is the base verse that opens up the midrashic imagination to comment, okay? Now, here is an ancient midrash that is cited by Ramban. Ramban lives in the 14th century in Spain, but he's citing in his commentary on the Torah a very old midrash that offers the link to Hanukkah, that offers us the association of this verse with the Hanukkah story. So Stan, could you read for us here what Ramban says on this verse?
And I have further seen in Yelamdenu and also in the Midrash Rabbah the following text.
So he says here, I've seen an important text that can help explain what's going on here. I'm going to interrupt you, Stan. Don't be offended.
All right. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, go and tell Aaron, fear not. You are designated for something of greater importance than this.
So let me explain what's going on here. All of the princes of the tribes come and bring gifts to the dedication of the sanctuary. So Aaron must be feeling a little bit like chopped liver. All of these people are bringing wonderful sacrifices to the altar, but what's in it for me? I mean, I don't get to bring a gift, and this is the place where I work. I'm the chief executive officer of the Mishkan, and there's no gift that is appropriate for me. So Moses, according to the Midrash, goes up to Aaron and says, fear not. What he really means by fear not is, don't feel left out. You are designated for something of greater importance than this. There's a more important role for you. Go ahead, Stan.
The offerings are brought only as long as the sanctuary is in existence, but the lamps will give light in front of the candelabrum forever. And all the blessings that I have given you with which to bless my children will never come to an end.
Okay, so there are 2 things, Aaron, that you will do which will never end, versus the sacrifices which all of the princes of the tribes are bringing, but those will end. Why will they end? Because when the temple is destroyed, there's no more sacrifices. So don't pay attention to the people bringing the sacrifices. Those are just here for the next few centuries. But forever, you will be credited with two rituals that will go on and on and on. And what are they? The lighting of the candelabrum. The lamps will give light in front of the candelabrum, Behalotcha et hanerot, and the blessings by which you will bless the children. What blessings are those, Stan?
We do that on Friday night, right?
You got it.
Right.
Or we do it at Duchening.
Yes.
More important on Duchening, right? Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, may God bless you and keep you. That's the priestly blessing, and the priestly blessing will continue after the temple is no longer around. In other words, that is a more enduring ritual that gets credited to Aaron versus the sacrifices, which don't last forever. But here's the question. Okay, go ahead, Stan.
Now it is an obvious fact that when the sanctuary is not in existence and the offerings are not brought because of its destruction, the lighting of the lamps of the candelabrum in the sanctuary also ceases. So what does the Midrash mean in saying that God promised Aaron that the lighting of the lamps would never stop?
So the Midrash's question is, okay, I understand the priestly blessing. The priestly blessing we still say today. That I understand. But what do you mean the lighting of the lamps will continue beyond the temple's destruction? Once there's no more temple, there's no more menorah. You all know the Arch of Titus, right? The picture of the menorah being carted off. There's no more lights anymore after the temple is destroyed. So what does it mean that that is an observance that will go on forever? And here is the answer. Go ahead, Stan.
Therefore, we must say that the sages of the Midrash were alluding to the lights of the dedication of the Hasmoneans.
What lights are those?
Hanukkah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, which applies on the festival of Hanukkah, even after the destruction of the sanctuary in our exile. Similarly, the priestly blessing, which is also juxtaposed to the dedication offerings of the princes, applies forever. Thus, the rabbis interpreted the proximity to the chapter of the dedication offerings of the princes of both the section before and after it in honor of Aaron, who is not included with the princes in these dedication offerings.
So in order to comfort Aaron, who feels left out of all of the dedication offerings that were offered by the princes of the tribes, we give to Aaron two rituals that will last forever: the lighting of the menorah and the priestly benediction. Now, the priestly benediction is obvious, but what you were teaching us, Stan, what you read is, but the lighting of the candles also goes on forever, because even after the temple is destroyed and there's no longer a golden menorah in the temple, we still light candles in honor, in memory, almost as a continuation of the same candles that were lit in the temple on Hanukkah. So that's a really important midrash that goes way, way back. We tend to explain the lighting of our menorahs by telling the story of Hanukkah, right? Explaining the story of the oil that only lasted a certain number of days, or maybe the story of the war, a few against the many. But what's really interesting here is that this adds another layer. The Midrash adds another layer to the reason for which we light our menorahs. It's saying this actually is not just about the story of Hanukkah. It is about recreating a temple ritual that goes all the way back to the time of the dedication of the sanctuary in the desert by Aaron, which is really extraordinary if you think about it, because how many temple rituals do we do nowadays? How many things do we do nowadays that can directly be traced to a temple ritual? You can think of maybe the shank bone that is on the Seder plate. Okay, that relates to a temple ritual. You can think of the challah that is separated. When you make challah on Friday night, you have to separate a piece of it and burn it. Okay, that's a temple ritual. But there's not much on the list of rituals that were performed on the temple that still have continuity today. And the Hanukkah menorah, according to this midrash, is one of them. Why do we light the Hanukkah menorah? Because this was such a core part of what it meant to worship God in the days of the sanctuary and the days of the temple. And we still remember that today. The rabbis famously say that prayer replaces the sacrifices, right? So we don't do the sacrifices today. Prayer is our replacement for them. Well, what is our replacement for the lighting of the menorah? Is it our prayers? No. It's the Hanukkah menorah. The lights are still being kindled in the same way that they were kindled back then. So we are in our own homes reenacting the ritual of Aaron and all of the high priests that came after them, who light the candles as a recreation of that ritual. Now, some of this, by the way, is incorporated in the rules of Hanukkah lighting. I think the most famous one is when we say in the song Hanerot Halalu, so after you light the candles, there's a piece you say, you sing Ma'osur, and then you say Hanerot Halalu Anu Madlikin Al Hanisim Ve'al Haniflaot, etc., etc. But part of that piece is we say these lights are Kodesh, Ve'asur lanu lehishtamesh bahen, and they're holy, and it's forbidden for us to use them. Now that's a little strange, right? Why would these lights be considered holy and forbidden for use? All they are just symbols. But this piece helps you understand why. These are not just symbols, these lights. We are recreating the lighting of the menorah that happened in the temple. And those lights were holy. And those lights could not be used to light your stove. And therefore, if we were to do that with our Hanukkah lights, it wouldn't be a true recreation. Our Hanukkah lights have to be seen as equivalent to the lighting of the candles in the temple. So that is Midrash number 1. The Midrash that connects this verse in the Torah with the lighting of our Hanukkah candles even today. Now here is Midrash number 2. Now Midrash number 2 here is not answering the question, why did God speak to Moses and then to Aaron, which is what the first Midrash tried to answer, right? It's going to answer the question, what does it mean setting up? What is the word beha'alotcha? When you lift up, when you raise up the lamps. Why does it say that word and not the word kindle? Doreen, would you be able to read for us this midrash? And I'm going to interrupt you frequently, okay? I need you to unmute.
Yes, I'm
There you go.
unmuted. It's
Okay.
Doreen. there's two Doreens. So it's Doreen Manley you're asking, or Doreen Levine?
Doreen Manley.
Thank you. Another interpretation at your setting up. This is what the verse says. Darkness is not dark for you. Night is as light as day. Darkness and light are the same.
Okay, stop there for a second. So let's understand the first question that the Midrash is asking. Sometimes a Midrash uses another verse in the Torah or in the Bible to explain the verse that it's interpreting. So here the question is, why does it say on your setting up or lifting up of the candles, you should do the following? And the Midrash says there's another verse that says, darkness is not dark for you. It's found in the Psalms. Night is as light as day. Darkness and light are the same. Why is that verse a contradiction? Or why is it a challenge to the original verse in the Torah? So I'm going to give you a hint here. The hint is God doesn't need light in order to see. That's what that verse in Psalms is saying. Darkness is not dark for you. Night is as light as the day. So why would God need a menorah? A menorah is something a person uses so that he can distinguish in the dark. But God doesn't need that. So what is the whole reason for us lighting a menorah in the tabernacle and later in the temple and later in our homes? Go ahead, Doreen.
And to us, he says, at your setting up, to what is the matter similar? To a king who had a loved one.
Here's the main story. Could you do me a favor, Doreen, and read this really slowly? This is, if you don't understand, if all of us don't understand, if we don't understand this story, we're going to be lost. So here is the story that the Midrash tells. We all have to be clear. Go ahead, Doreen.
The king said, know that I will eat with you. So go and prepare for me.
So this is the fable. The Midrash is going to tell a story. It's saying, I will explain to you exactly how to understand this verse, but the way we will understand it is by telling a fable. The fable is of a king who had a friend, and the king said to the friend, guess what? I'm coming over for lunch, or I'm coming over for dinner. And go and prepare for me, beha'alotcha, set it up, right? Set up the meal for me. And obviously the king's friend is not a king. The king's friend is just a regular person.
The loved one went and prepared an ordinary couch, an ordinary lamp, menorah, an ordinary table. When the king came, he brought his assistants around him and a golden lamp before him.
So imagine the king arriving. The friend went to the trouble of setting up the meal, but the things that he set up are just ordinary furniture, right? It's all he had. But when the king comes in, he comes in with his whole entourage. And the entourage has all of these fancy things, including a golden lamp before him, right? So that the king could eat properly.
When the loved one saw all the glory of the king, he became ashamed and hid all he had prepared for the king, since they all were ordinary.
Right. So do you understand, Doreen, what happened? He saw, oh my gosh, look at all of these people and the golden lamp. Look at all I have are these simple things. I will quickly hide all of this stuff because I'm ashamed that the small furniture and cutlery that I have isn't appropriate for a king that eats with a golden lamp.
The king said to him, "Did I not tell you I would eat with you? Why have you prepared nothing for me?" The loved one said to him, "I saw all the glory that you came with, and I was ashamed and hid all I had prepared for you, for they were all ordinary things." The king said to him, "By your life, I swear that I will ruin all my things that I brought with me, and for the sake of your love, I will not use anything except your possessions."
Okay, let's stop there. This story is trying to elucidate what word in the verse, the word setting up, beha'alotcha et hanerot, and it also helps to understand the word el mul pnei hamenorah, opposite the menorah. Look carefully at what is going on in this story. It opens up saying or asking the question, what does God need the light of the menorah for? God doesn't need light. All of existence is as light before him, even when it is dark. God didn't need, just like the king, right, doesn't need his friend to set up lunch for him. The king has all the chefs in the world. He can have whatever he wants for lunch. So why did the king want to have lunch with this friend? Why was it important for him, Doreen? What do you think?
He wants to show him love for him and true friendship.
So this is why I chose to study this piece after our class, Enmity and Comedy, because what is the common feature between this story and what we've been learning in the past week? Sharing a meal. Remember, that's what we were talking about in our last class. The idea in Jewish literature that you share more than just food when you sit down and have lunch with a friend. Let me repeat that again. You share more than just food when you sit down and have lunch with a friend. The king didn't need the food of the simple person. He just wanted to have a relationship, to have a friend. He just wanted somebody to talk to, someone to sit down and have lunch with. You feel bad for the king almost. That's why the king was so bothered when his friend was ashamed and took away his dishes, because the king feels that his stature and his, let's say, his fancy titles and all of his treasures will detract from the quality of that relationship. He won't be able to have a relationship with the person if the person keeps being ashamed by what he has versus what the king has. Now let's switch the characters of the friend and the king with the characters of God and the Jewish people represented by Aaron lighting the menorah, but it could also be represented by all of us lighting the menorah. Doreen, do you see the connection between the king and the friend and Aaron and God?
I'm trying to elucidate.
Well, think about it this way. Yeah, go ahead.
God feels ashamed.
By the way, the hint is in all midrashim, when there's a king, the king is God. I don't know if that's obvious to everybody, but whenever there's a king, the king is God.
So God is trying to show Aaron that it doesn't matter that he doesn't have a gift. He's not bringing a gift to the temple, but there's more to it. That there,
And
that
why
he
does
loves, that
why
he loves them. He loves them.
yes,
He
yes,
loves
and
them, and it
that's
doesn't
right.
matter
He loves him and it doesn't matter. And why does he want those lights? Why does he want him to set up those lights?
because they'll endure forever.
Not because they'll endure forever, according to the story. According to this story, what value? Think about it, everybody. Why
Well,
does God want those lights? The verse says in Psalms, God doesn't need light. So why does God want his friend, want Aaron, to raise lights?
because it's so important to Aaron,
Yes,
and God wants to show him that he holds him in such high esteem
and God
and loves him.
yes, and God wants a relationship. Just like the king wants a relationship with his friend, so does God want a relationship. And God doesn't need any of the things that we have. God doesn't need our lights. God doesn't need our menorah. God doesn't need our offerings. God doesn't need any of this stuff. So that's the symbol of the king coming in with his golden menorah. So if we truly wanted to have a relationship with God, we would say, well, what can we do? There's nothing that I can offer to God that God doesn't already have. Think of your friend that, it's their birthday's coming along, and this is a friend that has everything in the world. And there's no gift that you could possibly bring them that they would value, because let's say they're wealthy and they could buy whatever they want, right? That's the same sort of image here. God doesn't need light. God doesn't need a menorah. God doesn't need anything in the temple. But God wants a relationship. And therefore, the lighting of the menorah is valuable, not because it's something God needs, but because it is a symbol of the love that exists between God and the Jewish people. The light is a symbol of that relationship. Aaron isn't raising those candles because God needs them. He's lifting them up in front, el mul pnei ha-menorah, against the menorah, almost as if, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but almost as if he's defying logic, defying God's light, because God doesn't need this light. But I will defy that idea anyway by lifting up my candles so that God can know that there is a relationship that exists. Now, what about this scene about God destroying his stuff, right? Or in the story, it's the king who says, I will ruin all of my things that I brought with me, and I will not use anything except your possessions. So God is a bit upset that Aaron is ashamed, or that his friend, that's the moral here, right? The friend is ashamed because that shame can get in the way of a real relationship. If you're embarrassed that all you have are these meager things, then the relationship cannot exist. So God says, don't worry about all the things that I have. I will hide them. I will destroy them. You won't see them, because it's more important to me that you have your ways of showing that I matter to you. We have to be able to sit down and have lunch together, right? and no one should be ashamed of what they have or their living room or their furniture, anything like that. Okay, so that is the first story that we've learned from the first fable that we've learned that tries to explain why it says that Aaron should light the candles el mul pnei ha-menorah, opposite the menorah. Okay, now let's keep going and do this second part of the Midrash. Violette, can I ask you to read this next part? It starts here, where it says, and so, right here.
And so the Holy One, Blessed One, sorry, I can see. And so the Holy Blessed One is entirely light, as it is said, Daniel 2:22. And the light dwells with him, and God says to Israel, prepare for me a menorah and lights.
So if God is entirely light, as it says in Daniel, and light dwells with him, it's almost silly that he would be saying, prepare for me menorah and lights.
Why is written there, Exodus 25:8, and they will make me a mikdash, and I will dwell in their midst.
A mikdash is a sanctuary, right? So the Midrash is saying, light, God is all light, but yet God commands in the book of Exodus to make me a sanctuary that I will dwell among them.
Yes.
And
make me a menorah of pure gold.
Right. So what does God need a house for? And what does God need a menorah for? God's issuing all these commandments, and God doesn't need those things.
So when you make it, the Shekinah comes.
So when you make it, the Shekinah comes. The Shekinah, we can talk a lot about what the Shekinah means, but at its root, it means a manifestation of God. In order to have God manifest, that is some symbol that God is there, you have to have a tent of meeting, you have to have the sanctuary, and you have to have those lights.
Why is it written there, Exodus 4:40-35, and Moshe was not able to enter the tent of meeting. Immediately, God called to Moshe. When Moshe went into the tent of meeting to speak with him, he would hear the voice speaking. What would he speak to him? Ask, you're setting up to the lights.
Sorry, so there's a word missing here. It should be,
yes.
It should be, he would hear the voice speaking. Mm-hmm. What would it speak to him? At your setting up of the lights. So originally, this is a bit tricky, I understand. It's a bit tricky to understand this midrash, but let me explain to you. I'll make it easy for you. God says, make me a sanctuary so that I can dwell within it. Now, what, according to this second part of the midrash, is God? God is all light. So God shows up into the sanctuary as he promised. He said, I will dwell within. And Moses is not able to enter. Why? Because Moses would be blinded by the powerful light that would take over the inside of the sanctuary. So God gets rid of his light and says to Moses, you set up these little lights for me. Now that relates to the story of the king, because it explains why God destroyed all of his possessions, why the king destroyed all of his possessions. In the story with the king, God destroys all of his possessions because that gets in the way of a relationship. The other person, his friend, feels ashamed. And the Midrash is saying that's exactly what happened in the story with Moses. God dwelled in that sanctuary, but Moses couldn't even go in because of the amount of light that was inside. So God had to diminish his light, take his light away, and said to Moses, why don't you light in this space in your own way with this candelabrum? What's really interesting about this last story is that it is saying that those little candles are a mini version of what God is. God is all light, so much light that it would be blinding for a person. But we can light these little lights, which is our way of bringing light and having a representation of God in our midst. And actually, that is a really core idea that you find in many places in Judaism, that a little bit of light is a symbol, a small symbol for God. Where most famously do we find that? Well, walk into any shul and you'll see above the ark the Ner Tamid. The Ner Tamid is supposed to be a small little reminder of God's manifestation, right? In this space, in whatever space it finds itself in. Light is a little symbol for God, because God is all light, and so much so that we couldn't even understand it. But if we make our own little version of the light, that helps to bring us in touch with what God is. By the way, that idea is picked up very strongly in the church, where the light is also, in a church also, a burning candle is a symbol for the presence of God. So one should expect these things in monotheistic religions, right? Especially the religions that are all rooted in Judaism. They take ideas that come from the sanctuary and the temple, and they recreate them. Or in this passage, it's not even a recreation. It's just we're continuing to follow that practice as the years go on. The candles we light, even on Hanukkah, are small little reminders of God's presence. Someone once said, someone once asked me, what is that Ner Tamid? Is that God? Is that what God is? But the answer is that light is not something you can touch, but light allows you to see things that would otherwise be invisible. And that's what God is. So light is actually a metaphor for God, right? God allows us to see things that would otherwise be invisible. That's what God is. The power that allows us to see what would otherwise be invisible. And that's why light is a perfect metaphor, because light also allows us to see things that would otherwise be invisible. So this is where I wanted to stop today, but just to give you a little hint of what we're going to do next class. This story about the king and the friend is interpreted different ways by the same one guy. he tells 3 different versions of the story of the king and the friend that each give a different message about Hanukkah. This one guy, it's almost rude for me to call him a guy, is called the Sfat Emet. The Sfat Emet is the Rebbe of Ger, who lived in the 19th century. Ger was a town in Poland. Still today, you can see the Gerer Hasidim. And his name was, I think, Yehuda Leib Alter. That was his real name. But the book that he wrote is called Sfat Emet. So, which is translated as true speech. And it's a collection of his insights on the Torah. And 3 times in that book, the Sfat Emet, he points to this story of the king and the friend to really emphasize understanding that story and its relevance to Hanukkah. For him, if you understand that story, you get what Hanukkah is about, but he reads it 3 different ways, with the king not always playing the same role, the friend not only playing the same role, and the role of shame and embarrassment. What is that about? Shame and embarrassment when we go about our service of God. By the way, and that connects you can see that connects to the Hanukkah story very carefully, right? Because, or in a very serious way, because part of what was going on, if you know the story of Hanukkah, is that the Hellenist Jews, those Jews who were more assimilationist with regards to Hellenic culture, they were accused of being ashamed of their particular Jewish identities. So there's a big role for shame in the story of Hanukkah, and how that shame was defeated by the Maccabees, who represented what? They represented pride and fearlessness in their identity. So is shame a positive religious motivator, or is it negative? And the Sfat Emet is going to go back and forth between those 2 ideas, but we'll leave that to next week. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording.